A racist chef refused to cook for Michelle and Barack Obama, but what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe, and where you're watching us from, write us in the comments. The evening was perfect, or so it seemed. The early autumn breeze had a crispness to it, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. Washington, D.C. glimmered with its usual vibrancy, and the city streets were alive with the hum of people wrapping up their day. For Barack and Michelle Obama, this particular evening was special. It marked their anniversary, a rare moment to step away from their busy lives and spend time together, just the two of them. Barack adjusted his tie as they stepped out of the sleek black car. Michelle, radiant in a simple yet elegant dress of deep blue, looped her arm through his. Their driver had pulled up in front of Le Cier, a famed restaurant known for its exclusivity and exquisite menu. The place was a monument to fine dining, a beacon for the elite. Tonight they had chosen it as their retreat, a quiet celebration of love and partnership. The maitre d', a tall, angular man with a rehearsed smile, greeted them at the door. His eyes briefly flicked over them before he gestured for the couple to follow. The smile, though polite, seemed perfunctory, lacking warmth. Michelle noticed it immediately, but said nothing. The maitre d' led them through a labyrinth of polished mahogany tables and flickering candlelight to a secluded corner near the window. The city lights sparkled in the distance, a perfect backdrop for their private evening. They sat down, their chairs drawn out ceremoniously. Barack glanced around the room, noting the subtle elegance of the decor: crystal chandeliers, soft classical music, and muted conversations creating a cocoon of sophistication. It was a space designed to intimidate and impress. Michelle leaned in, her voice soft. "This is beautiful," she said, her eyes meeting his. There was a contentedness in her tone, though her expression carried a trace of unease. Barack, always attuned to her moods, reached across the table and took her hand. "I thought you'd like it," he replied with a small smile. "It's not often we get a night like this. Let's make it count." The waiter appeared then, a younger man with an impeccably pressed uniform and a slightly distracted air. He placed two menus in front of them with a brisk nod, muttering something about water before disappearing. His lack of enthusiasm caught Michelle's attention. She exchanged a glance with Barack, but let it go. They had both grown accustomed to subtle dismissals in spaces like this. As they browsed the menu, the faint hum of conversation from the surrounding tables seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, a few glances, a murmured comment here and there. Michelle noticed it before Barack did. She lowered her menu slightly, her gaze sweeping the room. A couple at a nearby table quickly averted their eyes, while another group barely concealed their whispers. Michelle's voice dropped, steady but concerned. "Are we imagining this, or—" Barack glanced up, his brow furrowing. He took in the room as if seeing it anew. The subdued stares, the way the atmosphere had grown heavier, it was unmistakable. "Looks like we've become the evening's entertainment," he said lightly, though his tone carried a note of frustration. The waiter returned with their drinks, a glass of wine for Michelle and sparkling water for Barack. He set them down with an audible clink, not quite meeting their eyes. Michelle thanked him politely, but he turned and left without a word. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. The tension in the room was palpable now. The hushed whispers had grown louder, more brazen. Barack noticed a man at a nearby table openly pointing in their direction, leaning over to speak to his companion. Michelle caught a fragment of their conversation, something about not expecting people like them here. Barack reached for her hand again, his touch grounding her. "Let's not let them ruin this," he said softly, though his jaw was tight. Just as Michelle was about to respond, a commotion erupted near the kitchen. The double doors swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp white chef's coat strode into the dining area. His presence commanded attention. Conversations ceased, and heads turned toward him. This was Peter Langston, the restaurant's head chef, a man as famous for his culinary genius as for his brash personality. Peter's eyes scanned the room with practiced authority before landing on the Obamas. A flicker of something, contempt, defiance, passed over his face. He began walking toward their table, his steps deliberate, his expression hard. The room held its collective breath. When he reached them, he stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice, when he spoke, was loud enough to carry across the room. "I don't cook for people like you," he said bluntly, his words slicing through the air like a blade. The silence was deafening. Michelle's hand tightened around Barack's, her nails digging into his skin. Barack remained calm, though his eyes darkened. "Excuse me?" Barack's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Peter smirked, gesturing broadly. "This isn't your kind of place. You should leave. We have standards here." A few scattered gasps punctuated the silence, but no one intervened. In fact, a small group of diners at a nearby table began clapping, light, hesitant applause that quickly grew bolder. Michelle's heart raced. Anger, humiliation, and disbelief warred within her. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. Barack, ever composed, leaned back slightly in his chair. "You seem to misunderstand," he said, his tone cool. "We're paying customers, and we have every right to be here." Peter took a step closer, his smirk widening. "Your money doesn't change the fact that you don't belong." The applause grew louder. A few diners raised their glasses in mock toasts. Michelle's face burned, but she refused to look away from Peter. At that moment, the restaurant's security staff appeared, as if summoned by some unspoken signal. One of the guards, a stocky man with a blank expression, addressed them directly. "Sir, ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to leave." Barack rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He towered over Peter, though his posture remained relaxed. He glanced at Michelle, who nodded almost imperceptibly, and then turned back to the guard. "No," he said firmly, "we're not leaving." The room seemed to hold its breath again. Barack's voice, though quiet, carried weight. "Call the police if you have to," he continued. "But we're not moving." Michelle felt a surge of pride and fear in equal measure. Her husband, as always, stood tall in the face of injustice, but the hostility in the room was palpable, and she couldn't shake the sense that they were surrounded by danger. As the tension reached its breaking point, several diners began pulling out their phones, recording the unfolding drama. The sound of shutters clicking and flashes filled the air. Barack leaned closer to Peter, his voice low but sharp. "You'll regret this," he said, "not because of us, but because of who you've chosen to be tonight." With that, he sat back down, his expression resolute. Michelle placed her hand over his, their fingers interlocking. Together they waited, unflinching, as the storm swirled around them. The night ended in a blur of flashing cameras, raised voices, and hurried footsteps. Michelle and Barack Obama left the restaurant under the uneasy watch of security guards, their exit filmed and scrutinized by dozens of patrons with phones in hand. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion inside. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, but Michelle could feel the weight of judgment pressing in on them from all sides. Barack's hand rested firmly on the small of her back as they walked to their car. He opened the door for her, his movement steady, though Michelle noticed the tension in his shoulders. Once inside, the car pulled away, leaving the glow of the restaurant's lights behind them. The silence that settled in the vehicle felt heavy. Michelle stared out the window, her reflection barely visible against the darkness outside. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and she forced herself to breathe deeply, trying to calm the fire in her chest. Barack remained silent beside her, his jaw tight as he stared straight ahead. "I can't believe that just happened," Michelle finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Barack exhaled sharply, as if releasing a weight he'd been carrying. "Neither can I." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "You handled it better than I could have," she said, "but, God, Barack, the way they looked at us, like we didn't belong." He met her gaze, his expression softening. "We do belong. That's the point." Michelle felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wasn't going to cry, not about this, not after everything they'd been through. Instead, she straightened in her seat and reached for Barack's hand. "We need to do something," she said firmly. Barack nodded, his expression darkening again. "We will." By the time they arrived home, the incident had already begun to ripple across the internet. Their phones buzzed endlessly. Calls, texts, notifications piling up faster than they could process. Michelle sat in the living room, scrolling through her feed as news outlets picked up the story. Former first couple denied service at elite restaurant. Chef refuses to cook for Obamas, citing standards. Racial discrimination scandal rocks prestigious dining establishment. Each headline felt like a fresh blow. Michelle's stomach churned as she scrolled through the comments. The reactions were as divided as she feared. Good for the chef. Not everyone has to bow to celebrities. Absolutely disgusting. How is this still happening in America? They deserved it. Stay in your lane. Boycott this place immediately. She looked up at Barack, who was pacing near the window, his phone pressed to his ear. He'd been on calls non-stop since they returned. Lawyers, activists, journalists. She could tell from his posture that the weight of the situation was settling heavily on him. When he finally hung up, Michelle stood and crossed the room to him. "What's the plan?" He rubbed the back of his neck, looking tired but determined. "We're not suing. Not yet, anyway. I don't want this to be about revenge. I want it to be about change." Michelle tilted her head. "How do we make that happen?" Barack smiled faintly, but there was steel in his eyes. "We start by showing them what real inclusivity looks like." The following day, the video from the restaurant exploded online. News anchors dissected every frame, analyzing the chef's words, the security's actions, and Barack's calm defiance. Activists staged protests outside the restaurant, holding signs that read, "Equality is always on the menu," and "No room for hate." The restaurant was bombarded with negative reviews, and calls for a boycott spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, the chef, Peter Langston, gave an exclusive interview to a conservative news outlet. In it, he defended his actions, claiming he had the right to refuse service to anyone who didn't fit the atmosphere of his establishment. He dismissed accusations of racism, calling them overreactions, and portraying himself as a victim of cancel culture. Michelle watched the interview with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "He's doubling down," she said, pausing the clip. "He doesn't even think he did anything wrong." Barack sat beside her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "That's the problem," he said. "People like him think they can get away with this because no one holds them accountable." Michelle exhaled slowly, her mind already racing ahead. "Then let's hold him accountable. But not with lawsuits or protests. Let's do something bigger, something that doesn't just call him out, but calls everyone in." Barack looked at her intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "A dinner," Michelle said, "but not just any dinner, a celebration of inclusion and diversity. We invite chefs from all over the world, people who faced discrimination, who fought to succeed despite the odds. And we make it public. We turn it into a movement." Barack's eyes lit up. A statement through food. Exactly. We show the world what it looks like when everyone has a seat at the table. The idea took shape quickly. Michelle reached out to chefs she admired, people who understood what it meant to be excluded and overlooked. The response was overwhelming. Within days, they had commitments from culinary stars across the country and beyond. Donations poured in to fund the event, and the media began buzzing about what was being called the People's Feast. But as excitement built, so did opposition. Supporters of Peter Langston staged counter-protests, accusing the Obamas of waging a campaign to destroy a traditional American business. Threatening letters arrived at their office, and anonymous messages flooded their inboxes. Michelle read one particularly nasty email aloud. "Stay out of our world. You'll never belong." She looked up at Barack, her jaw tight. "They really think they can scare us off." Barack leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "They don't understand who they're dealing with." Michelle smiled despite herself. "No, they don't." As plans for the event moved forward, tensions escalated. The restaurant laid off staff due to plummeting sales, and Peter Langston gave another defiant interview, calling the Obamas' dinner a publicity stunt. Meanwhile, Michelle and Barack worked tirelessly, ensuring that the People's Feast would be more than just a meal. It would be a message. But even as they poured their energy into the project, Michelle couldn't shake the memory of Peter's face, the raw anger and defiance in his eyes. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The room hummed with activity. Phones buzzed, laptops clicked, and voices overlapped as Michelle and Barack sat in the heart of their makeshift command center, an airy loft they'd rented for planning the event. Posters and sticky notes lined the walls, scrawled with lists of chefs, suppliers, and timelines. The People's Feast was no longer just an idea. It was a movement in the making, and every hour brought them closer to its realization. Michelle leaned over a table cluttered with papers and notebooks, double-checking schedules and media contacts. Across the room, Barack paced while talking on the phone, his voice calm but purposeful. "We need their confirmation today," he said into the receiver. "We can't afford any last-minute changes. Let me know as soon as you hear back." He hung up and looked over at Michelle, his expression mixing determination with exhaustion. That was Chef Ramirez. "He's in." Michelle allowed herself a rare smile. Ramirez was one of the most sought-after chefs in the country, and his participation added weight to their cause. "Good," she said, "but we still need someone to handle the vegetarian menu. Did Shanti Patel get back to us?" Barack checked his phone. "Not yet, but I'll follow up." The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual as the hours slipped by. With less than 2 weeks until the event, every decision felt monumental. Michelle knew they couldn't afford to stumble, not when so many eyes were watching, waiting for them to either fail spectacularly or prove their critics wrong. Their opposition wasn't sitting idle. Peter Langston supporters had intensified their campaign, painting the feast as an attack on tradition and labeling the Obamas as elitists in disguise. Protests outside the restaurant had escalated, forcing its temporary closure. But instead of backing down, Langston had doubled down. A new interview aired that morning, showing him standing in his empty dining room. "This isn't just about me," he said, gesturing to the vacant tables. "It's about defending values, about standing up for the integrity of fine dining. The Obamas don't care about that. They care about headlines. They care about tearing down what others have built." Michelle had watched the clip in silence, her jaw tightening with each word. When it ended, she turned off the TV and gone back to work. She wouldn't give Langston the satisfaction of knowing he'd rattled her. But beneath her resolve, doubts simmered. Was this the right approach? Could one dinner really change the conversation? Or were they fighting a losing battle? She voiced these thoughts later that night, after the chaos of the day had settled. She and Barack sat on their balcony, a bottle of wine between them. The city lights stretched out below, reminding her of the night they'd walked out of that restaurant, humiliated but defiant. "Do you ever wonder if we're putting too much into this?" she asked quietly. Barack took a sip of his drink before answering. "Of course. But what's the alternative? Do nothing? Let people like Langston keep setting the rules?" Michelle shook her head. "No, sometimes it feels like we're trying to fix something too big to fix." Barack reached over and took her hand. "It's big," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean it's impossible." His words settled her, as they always did, but the weight of responsibility lingered. The following days passed in a blur of meetings, calls, and interviews. The roster of chefs grew, featuring names from across the country and around the world. Chefs who'd faced discrimination, poverty, and systemic barriers, but had risen above them. Chef Amira Hassan, who'd fled civil war in Syria and built a thriving restaurant in New York, signed on. So did Carlos Mendoza, a second-generation immigrant who'd turned his family's street food cart into a Michelin-starred establishment. Their stories became part of the larger narrative, a testament to resilience and unity. As the pieces came together, the logistics grew more complicated. The venue, an old theater converted into an event space, required extensive renovations to accommodate a commercial kitchen. Suppliers had to be coordinated, permits secured, and security arrangements finalized. Michelle oversaw every detail, refusing to delegate the most critical decisions. She spent late nights reviewing layouts and double-checking orders, determined to deliver an experience that matched their vision. Meanwhile, Barack focused on the message. He gave interviews emphasizing the event's purpose, not as a protest but as a celebration. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," he told one reporter. "It's about building something better. It's about showing what's possible when we come together instead of letting fear divide us." But despite their efforts, the threats persisted. Anonymous messages flooded their inboxes, warning them to cancel the event. One particularly chilling letter arrived without a return address. "You don't belong here. Walk away, or we'll make sure you regret it." Michelle read it twice before handing it to Barack. He frowned but didn't flinch. "They're scared," he said. "That means we're doing something right." Still, the tension grew. Security measures were tightened, and staff underwent additional training to handle potential disruptions. Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. And then, Just days before the feast, Peter Langston made his move. A press release announced a rival event, The True Taste of America, scheduled for the same night as the People's Feast. Langston framed it as a tribute to real culinary excellence, featuring traditional dishes and chefs who honor their roots. The media pounced on the story, framing it as a battle between two visions of America. Michelle felt her stomach drop as she read the headlines. "They're turning this into a competition," she said. Barack didn't look surprised. "Of course they are, but that doesn't change our focus." He was right, but Michelle knew the stakes had risen. Their dinner wasn't just about food anymore. It was about identity, values, and who had the right to define them. As the final preparations unfolded, Michelle stood in the empty theater, taking it all in. The polished floors, the rows of tables waiting to be filled, the stage where chefs would present their dishes. It was beautiful, but it was also fragile. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the moment settle around her. Then she opened them and stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The theater buzzed with nervous energy. Hours before the doors were set to open, the space was already alive with movement, chefs preparing their stations, staff arranging table settings, and journalists setting up their cameras. The scent of spices, roasting vegetables, and freshly baked bread filled the air, weaving together aromas from all over the world. Michelle Obama stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, scanning the room as final preparations came together. The rows of tables, each adorned with crisp white linens and simple floral arrangements, stretched out in perfect symmetry. The open kitchen setup at the back of the stage was bustling with activity as chefs called out instructions and hurried to perfect their dishes. But, despite the flurry of movement, Michelle couldn't shake the weight pressing down on her chest. The looming presence of Peter Langston's competing event hovered in the back of her mind, a shadow that refused to disappear. Reports of his gathering had dominated the morning news cycle. Pundits framed the night as a clash of cultures, pitting tradition against inclusion, elitism against accessibility. Barack approached, his calm demeanor anchoring her as always. "Everything's coming together," he said, looking around the room. "You've done an incredible job." Michelle exhaled slowly. "It's not just about how it looks," she said. "It's about whether people feel it, whether they leave tonight believing in something better. They will." He took her hand briefly before stepping away to speak with one of the chefs. Michelle turned back to her checklist, but her thoughts wandered. She imagined Langston's event across town, polished, exclusive, and full of people clinging to an idea of what dining should look like. She pictured his smug confidence, the unwavering certainty of someone who believed the world should stay exactly as it was. A voice snapped her back to the present. "Mrs. Obama?" She turned to find Amira Hassan, the Syrian-born chef who'd become one of the highlights of the evening's lineup. Amira was holding a tray of carefully arranged appetizers, small, delicate pastries filled with spiced lamb and pine nuts. "Everything is ready," Amira said with a smile, though Michelle could sense the nervousness beneath it. "Thank you, Amira." Michelle reached out to steady the tray. "These look amazing." Amira's smile grew, but it faltered for just a moment. "Do you think they'll come? The people who need to see this?" Michelle met her gaze. "They're already here," she said, motioning to the growing line of guests outside the theater. "And they'll keep coming." By the time the doors opened, the crowd stretched down the block. Families with children, young couples, elderly neighbors, and people from every walk of life filtered into the theater. Some wore formal attire, while others came in jeans and jackets. The diversity of the crowd was striking, a reflection of the vision Michelle and Barack had hoped to create. But with the excitement came tension. Security guards flanked the entrance, their eyes scanning the street for signs of trouble. Protesters had gathered across the road holding signs that read, "Keep politics off the plate," and "Respect tradition." Michelle noticed them immediately, her stomach tightening. She'd known there would be opposition, but seeing it so close, so loud, was another matter entirely. Barack joined her near the entrance, following her gaze. "They're not the ones who matter tonight," he said quietly. "Focus on the people inside." Michelle nodded, but the knots in her stomach didn't loosen. Inside, the energy shifted as the dinner began. Servers moved gracefully through the crowd, delivering plates of vibrant dishes that told stories of resilience and heritage. Each course was introduced by its creator, giving the chefs a chance to share their journeys, from refugee camps to Michelin-starred kitchens, from street carts to fine dining establishments. The guests listened intently, their reactions ranging from awe to tears. Amira's story, in particular, struck a chord. She spoke about fleeing Syria with nothing but her grandmother's recipes and the determination to survive. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Michelle felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around the room. This was what they'd set out to do. And then she saw him. Peter Langston stood near the entrance, half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't dressed in his usual chef's whites, but in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Michelle's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to come. Not here, not tonight. Her first instinct was to approach him, to demand why he was there, but something held her back. Instead, she watched as he lingered near the edge of the room, his gaze sweeping over the tables and the people seated around them. He looked out of place, like an intruder in a space he didn't belong to. But there was something else, too, a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the armor he'd worn so confidently. Barack noticed him, too. "Do you want me to handle this?" he asked quietly. Michelle shook her head. "Not yet." Instead, she waited. Minutes passed and Peter didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped further inside. By the time dessert was served, Peter was seated at the back of the room. No one approached him, but no one turned him away either. Michelle watched as he picked at his plate, his posture stiff. And then, to everyone's surprise, he stood up. The room fell silent as Peter walked toward the stage. Michelle's heart pounded. She glanced at Barack, who gave her a slight nod. Peter reached the microphone and cleared his throat. His voice, when he finally spoke, lacked its usual confidence. "I wasn't invited," he said, "and I'm not sure I deserve to be here. But I needed to see this." He looked out at the audience, his gaze lingering on the chefs. "I built my restaurant on the idea that food should reflect tradition, that it should have standards, and I thought that meant keeping things exclusive, keeping people out." He paused, his voice catching. "But I was wrong." The words hung in the air. "I've spent my career trying to protect something I thought was fragile, but tonight I saw something stronger. I saw people coming together over food, not because of what separates them, but because of what connects them." Michelle felt tears streaming down her face. She wasn't alone. Peter stepped back from the microphone, his shoulders sagging as if a weight had been lifted. The applause started slowly, then grew louder until the entire room was on its feet. Michelle locked eyes with Barack, and for the first time all night, the knots in her stomach began to loosen. The applause still echoed in Michelle's ears as the final plates were cleared and the guests began to filter out into the cool night air. The theater's once bustling dining area now stood in disarray. Empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and half-melted candles scattered across linen-draped tables. But despite the remnants of the evening's chaos, the room hummed with something deeper than exhaustion. It was a feeling Michelle couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, or maybe something closer to hope. Peter Langston had left shortly after his unexpected speech, slipping out quietly through the side exit. Michelle hadn't spoken to him directly, though his words continued to replay in her mind. I was wrong. She didn't know what would come next for him, whether his admission would lead to real change or if it was merely the start of a longer reckoning. But in that moment, she chose to believe in the possibility of transformation. Barack approached, loosening his tie and glancing around the room. Looks like we survived. Michelle smiled, leaning against the edge of one of the tables. Barely. His eyes softened as he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You pulled it off, Michelle. Every single person in this room felt something tonight. She let out a small, disbelieving laugh. Did you see their faces? I don't think I've ever seen people cry over appetizers before. Barack grinned. Food has a way of doing that. It's not just about what's on the plate. It's about what it represents. Michelle's expression turned more serious. Speaking of that, what do we do now? Tonight was incredible, but we both know it's not enough, not by itself. Barack nodded. We build on it. We keep the momentum going. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. But beginnings were rarely simple. The following weeks were a whirlwind of interviews, debates, and media analysis. Footage from the People's Feast went viral, with clips of chefs sharing their stories racking up millions of views. Amira Hassan's heartfelt account of fleeing Syria and finding freedom through food became a rallying cry for inclusion. Carlos Mendoza's story of turning a food truck into a Michelin-starred restaurant inspired countless headlines. Even Peter Langston's speech, raw and unexpected, sparked discussions across the country. Some hailed it as a turning point, a sign that even the most entrenched views could shift. Others dismissed it as damage control, questioning whether his words were sincere or simply calculated to salvage his reputation. Michelle and Barack stayed above the noise, refusing to let the event become a sideshow. Instead, they focused on what came next. One morning, Michelle sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through emails. Her inbox was flooded with messages, from strangers thanking her for the event, from chefs offering their support, and from organizers asking how they could replicate the dinner in their own cities. But one email stood out. From Peter Langston. Subject, an idea. Michelle hesitated before opening it. Michelle, I wanted to thank you for the invitation I didn't deserve and for not turning me away when I showed up. I've been thinking a lot about what I said that night, about what I saw, and I think I finally understand what you were trying to do. I want to be part of it. If you're willing, I'd like to meet and talk about how we move forward. Peter. She read it twice, then a third time, before calling Barack into the room. What do you think? She asked, handing him the phone. Barack skimmed the message, his expression unreadable at first, but then he set the phone down and smiled faintly. I think he's serious, Barack said, or at least he wants to be. Michelle tapped her fingers against the table. Do you really think someone like Peter can change, or is this just him trying to fix his public image? Barack leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. People don't usually risk humiliation unless they mean it. He didn't have to show up that night, and he definitely didn't have to speak. That took something more than damage control. Michelle wasn't sure if she was ready to trust Peter, but something about his email stirred her curiosity. She typed out a brief response, agreeing to meet him the following week. The meeting took place at a quiet cafe, not Peter's restaurant, but a small neighborhood spot where the smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the air. Michelle arrived early, ordering a tea she barely touched as she waited. When Peter finally walked in, he looked different, less guarded, almost hesitant. He sat down, folding his hands on the table. "Thank you for coming," he said. Michelle studied him carefully. "I wasn't sure if I should." Peter let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. "I don't blame you." He paused, searching for words. "The truth is, I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night. About what I said, what I believed, what I still believe, if I'm being honest." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "Still?" "I grew up believing that food should mean something," Peter said, "that it should have history and tradition behind it. But somewhere along the way, I let that turn into an excuse for shutting people out, for keeping things small and safe instead of letting them grow." Michelle softened slightly, and now, Peter exhaled. "Now, I'm starting to realize that tradition doesn't have to mean exclusion. That growth doesn't have to mean losing what's important." Watching those chefs work together that night, seeing the way people connected over their food, it made me think about what I'm missing, what my restaurant is missing. Michelle leaned forward. "So, what do you want to do about it?" Peter's gaze steadied. "I want to start over." The words hung between them. "I'm closing the restaurant," he continued, "or at least, I'm closing it as it is now. I want to reopen it as something different, a place where people feel welcome no matter who they are or where they come from. And I want your help to do it." Michelle felt a surge of disbelief. She'd expected apologies, maybe even defensiveness, but not this. "You're serious?" Peter nodded. "I don't expect you to trust me right away, and I know it's going to take time, but I'm ready to learn. I'm ready to listen." Michelle didn't answer immediately. Instead, she thought about the people who'd shown up at the People's Feast, the families, the chefs, the strangers who left feeling less like strangers. She thought about the letters and emails pouring in, asking for more events like it. And she thought about Peter's speech, raw and uncertain, but honest. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said, "let's start." Over the next several weeks, Michelle and Peter worked together, drafting plans for the restaurant's transformation. Michelle insisted that it not just be symbolic, that it needed to include affordable pricing, community events, and partnerships with local organizations. Peter agreed to all of it, even as it pushed him out of his comfort zone. Barack, meanwhile, helped spread the word. He met with city officials to secure funding and permits, ensuring that the project had institutional backing. He also continued speaking publicly about the importance of food as a tool for unity, inspiring others to launch similar initiatives. But not everyone was ready to forgive Peter. Protests continued outside his closed restaurant, with signs accusing him of being a sellout. Others dismissed his efforts as nothing more than a calculated PR move. Michelle worried that the backlash would derail their progress, but Peter refused to back down. One night, as they sat reviewing blueprints for the remodeled space, he looked up at her and said, "You know what the hardest part of all this is?" Michelle shook her head, "Not knowing if it'll ever be enough." "It won't be," Michelle said honestly. "Not by itself. but it's a start. By the time the restaurant reopened, the story had shifted. Reporters who once covered the protests now focused on the renovations, interviewing new hires from diverse backgrounds and spotlighting the partnerships Peter had built with local food banks and shelters. Michelle and Barack attended the opening night, sitting quietly at a corner table as Peter moved through the room, shaking hands and welcoming guests. The energy felt different, less tense, more open. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And then something unexpected happened. A woman approached their table, her hands trembling slightly. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "My son, he's one of the new cooks here. He used to think places like this weren't for people like us, but now he's proud to be part of it." Michelle reached out and took the woman's hand. "Thank you for sharing that." After the woman left, Michelle looked at Barack, her eyes shining. "This is why we did it." Barack smiled. "And we're just getting started." As the evening wound down, Michelle stepped into the kitchen where Peter was overseeing the final plates of the night. He looked up, surprised to see her there. "I just wanted to say congratulations," she said. Peter wiped his hands on a towel. "For what?" "For proving that change is possible." Peter hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks to you." Michelle shook her head. "No, thanks to you." And for the first time since that night in the restaurant, she felt the knots in her stomach finally untangle. The weeks after the restaurant's reopening passed in a blur of activity. Michelle and Barack juggled interviews, meetings, and follow-ups with the team they had helped assemble. The transformation of Peter Langston's restaurant into a socially conscious dining space, now called Common Ground, had drawn national attention. Critics praised the menu, which celebrated diverse cuisines and featured dishes inspired by the chefs who had participated in the People's Feast. But the story didn't end there. Michelle found herself constantly checking updates about the restaurant, as though waiting for something to go wrong. Despite the positive headlines, anonymous threats and criticism continued to appear online. Some accused Peter of exploiting the cultural moment for profit, while others dismissed the Obamas' involvement as a vanity project. Still, Michelle couldn't ignore the tangible changes she witnessed. Families gathered at Common Ground's communal tables, sharing meals and conversations. Aspiring chefs from underrepresented backgrounds began training in Peter's kitchen, learning not only culinary skills, but also the value of openness and inclusion. Peter himself seemed transformed, quieter, more deliberate. He still carried the confidence of a man who had spent years at the top of his field, but it no longer came across as arrogance. Instead, Michelle saw humility in the way he greeted guests and mentored his staff. One evening, as Michelle sat at the kitchen table reading through emails, she noticed one marked anonymous. Her first instinct was to delete it. Too many anonymous messages had been cruel or threatening, but something about the subject line stopped her. "I was wrong." Her pulse quickened as she opened the email. "Michelle, I've been watching what you've done with Peter and the restaurant. It's forced me to confront things I didn't want to face. About myself, about this country, and about the things I've stood for. I was one of the people at Le Ciel that night. I laughed, I clapped, and I told myself I was defending tradition. But the truth is, I was defending my fear of change, fear of losing what I thought was mine. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'm grateful for what you're doing. You didn't just prove me wrong, you showed me what's possible when we let go of fear. Thank you." There was no name, no signature, but the words lingered long after Michelle had finished reading. She forwarded the email to Barack, then leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe this was how change happened. Not in sweeping gestures, but in small, quiet moments when people chose to see the world differently. The next day, Michelle shared the email with Peter during one of their meetings. He read it in silence, then looked up. "Do you believe it's real?" he asked. Michelle nodded. "I think it's as real as your apology was." Peter didn't answer right away. Instead, he folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "I hope there are more of these out there," he said finally. Over time, there were. Letters, emails, and messages poured in from across the country. Some came from supporters, others from former critics who had reconsidered their views. And while there were still doubters, the tide was shifting. But Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that Peter's journey wasn't over yet. One afternoon, as she and Barack prepared for another round of interviews, Michelle received an unexpected package in the mail. It was a small, unmarked box with no return address. Inside, she found a handwritten note and an old, weathered recipe card. "Michelle, this is the recipe my grandmother taught me, the first dish I ever learned to cook. I wanted you to have it because in some ways, this is where it all started for me. Cooking was always my way of holding on to the past, but I see now that it can also be a way of reaching out to the future. Thank you for showing me that." Michelle traced her fingers over the faded ink, touched by the gesture. She showed the card to Barack that evening, and together they decided to feature Peter's recipe at the next People's Feast, not as a symbol of forgiveness, but as a testament to growth and possibility. Peter didn't attend the second feast. Instead, he had quietly stepped back from the spotlight, leaving his restaurant in the hands of his new team and embarking on a journey to explore the cuisines and cultures he had once resisted. Michelle followed his travels through occasional updates, photos of street food in Bangkok, a handwritten note about learning to make pasta in Italy. And then, after months of silence, a final postcard arrived. It was from Morocco, featuring an image of a bustling market filled with spices and baskets of produce. "Michelle, this journey has taught me more than I ever imagined. I've been humbled by the generosity of strangers and inspired by the resilience of people who use food to tell their stories. I don't know where this road ends, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out. Thank you for everything. Peter." Michelle read the postcard twice before pinning it to the bulletin board in her office. She smiled, thinking about how far they had all come. Later that evening, as she and Barack prepared dinner at home, Michelle reflected on the journey they had taken, not just with Peter, but with everyone who had been touched by the events of the past year. "This started with a dinner," she said, stirring a pot of sauce. Barack smiled as he set the table, "and it ended with something bigger." Michelle looked out the window where the lights of the city twinkled in the distance. "No," she said softly, "it didn't end. It's still going." Barack paused, meeting her gaze. "You're right," he said. "It's just the beginning." Thank you for finishing this video. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends if it caught your eye. Check out the channel for other videos you might be interested in. Where are you watching us from? Write in the comments.